Okay, and good morning, everybody. Before we start today, I want to clarify a comment I made yesterday. I talked about canceling a Thursday morning class, and I think I mentioned this before, the code red drill is a fire drill. Anyways. We'll get to this in a minute. Well, rather than wait, I'll just, because I don't know who knows how long this is going to go on. I had mentioned canceling a Thursday morning class because of a following midterm, and I gave the impression incorrectly that that would happen this week. It's next week that it might happen. All right, so again, I'll be posting any announcement about that. It's very likely that next Thursday's class will not be held because, as I said, I have a midterm immediately following that, and it would be a little awkward to try and do that. But check the Avenue postings next week to make sure. Okay, so I want to press on now with our consideration of positive traits, values, and attitudes, and we were looking at meaning and meaningfulness. And I want to just continue with that. Hang on a second. Whoops, I just got to turn this on first. There we go. And I frankly don't know why I put this information in here. It probably belonged in our early discussion of money and subjective well-being, but here it is, and so I mention it anyway. We had talked about the role of materialism and the love of stuff and things as associated with lower levels of subjective well-being, and this is yet another example of this. Study done about 20 years ago, in which what they did was they activated an individual's anxiety by having them write about death. And they then asked that group or a group that had written about something unrelated to that to estimate their future income and to estimate what proportion of their income they would end up spending on stuff, on things. And what they found was that when anxiety had been activated by requiring individuals to think about and write about death, they increased their estimates of how much money they would make. in the future. So it's suggesting that the value of money had increased in their eyes as a consequence of this anxiety-inducing procedure. And they also increased the estimates of how much money, of what proportion of their income they ended up spending on stuff, on things. And the argument the authors make about this is they suggest that maybe what's happening here is that it's low levels of emotional well-being, a personal anxiety that triggers higher levels of concern about material possessions, materialism, and so on, and that might be the reason for this kind of finding. Now, as we indicated earlier, in general, the literature on money and happiness and subjective well-being suggests that beyond the level where individuals are able to fully meet their basic needs, there is relatively little increase in subjective well-being or happiness with increases in income. It does increase, but the rate of increase becomes much smaller as you get up into higher levels of income and so on. And again, a point we made before, it'll come up again in a minute with respect to meaningfulness, that happiness itself is not or should not be a goal, right? I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the classic words in the U.S. Declaration of Independence indicating that we all have the right to the pursuit of happiness, as though that goal was important. And the literature, and of course in philosophical writings going back several thousand years, the argument and the data has been made, and the data have suggested that in fact happiness is not something you can pursue for its own sake. That you're going to decide you're going to be happy, right? Oh, Lord God, here we go.
Attention please, code red drill for 3Y, all clear. Code red drill, all clear, 3Y. Code red drill, all clear, 3Y.
Okay. Instead, we see happiness as a consequence, as a byproduct of other activities, that typically involve the creation of meaning or purpose. The pursuit of goals that typically transcend the individual, transcend the personal ego, right? So happiness is a consequence, not a goal in itself. It's something we seek. This is very much like flow. Remember that when we talk about flow, we talk about the fact that while you're in flow, you're not happy. Because being happy would require you to devote cognitive resources to evaluating your emotional state. And you can't do that in flow because all of your cognitive resources are required to deal with the challenge that you're facing. It's only afterward, as a consequence of having succeeded in this activity, that you then look back and you then become happy. So happiness in the flow state is a consequence of having pursued this flow activity for some period of time. Okay. We've talked about, and the literature very clearly indicates the significance of meaningfulness or meaning and purpose in individuals' lives. And we can conceive of meaning making or meaning creating as occurring at two different levels of abstraction. On the higher level of abstraction, what we're going to call here global meaning making, we're talking about the establishment, the creation of overall values that guide the major decisions that we make in our lives. These are basic ethical, moral values that contribute significantly to the choices we make, the directions we go, and the goals we pursue. More common, I wouldn't say more significant necessarily, but some people argue that it is, we create or look for or find meaning in everyday events. In particular, cases where things have gone badly. Cases where we fail, cases where we sustain a loss significant loss of some sort, loss of a job, loss through death or otherwise of a loved one, and so on. And one of the ways in which we get through these situations is to try and create or find or establish meaning for ourselves in this unfortunate event. And there are basically, I've mentioned this before, there are basically two kinds of meaning seeking that we go through in these specific negative situations. One is to try, whenever possible, to find a positive value in what has happened to us. We're looking for the silver lining in the dark cloud. I mean, this is where that phrase comes from. For every dark cloud, there is a silver lining. The notion being that no event or very few events are completely 100% bad. Very often there is some, it may be small, but some positive that comes out of or arises out of a negative situation. And as part of making meaning and dealing with these negative events, we try to find or imagine what the positive might be in any given negative event. So that's benefit finding. The second thing we do at a kind of, often at a grander level, often at a spiritual level, is trying to find purpose, trying to decide why an event happened, and attributing a purpose to it that, and a reason for it that, again, makes sense out of it and makes it in some respects more meaningful. Again, we see this very, very, very commonly when individuals are relying on their faith, their religious or spiritual faith, to deal with adversity. They may attribute, for example, a negative event to God's will. And that, in some respects at least, softens the blow of having to deal with this particular event. Because, of course, there is always a positive purpose in anything that God makes happen. And so, therefore, however dark and dire this particular situation is, again, loss of a loved one and death and so on, there must be a positive reason for this. We may not ever know what it is, but nevertheless, we comfort ourselves with the thought that there is such a reason, such a purpose, whether known or unknown, and that makes it somewhat easier for us to deal with whatever loss we have sustained in this particular case. Okay, any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. Now, I think I made this point before, but most of the people who write about meaningfulness and its relation to happiness make the very same point. And that is that meaningfulness by itself does not create or lead to happiness. It is not the same. Feeling that a situation or circumstance or even one's entire life is meaningful is not the same as being happy. These are different things. And the argument goes, and the data are consistent with the notion that meaningfulness is necessary for happiness to be present, but it's not sufficient by and in and of itself. There are individuals who wrote Viktor Frankl, for example, who wrote about experiences in the Nazi work and death camps in World War II. And he talked about individuals who found meaning and purpose in their experience in those camps, even though, of course, they were at no point happy about what was happening to them. So one can have meaningfulness without being happy, but we can't seem to have happiness, at least not in the full sense, without meaningfulness in our life as well. Okay. One of the, or two maybe, of the things that creating, finding, establishing meaning or meaningfulness does for us is it gives us a sense of who we are. It establishes to a great degree what our self-identity is. What are the values, the purposes for which our life is being lived? And that, in many respects, defines who we are in some very significant and important ways. It also, in the self-esteem kind of way, suggests that we are, because we are pursuing these values, that there is this meaningfulness in our life, that we are, by definition, and by virtue of that fact, a person of worth, of value, of significance, and so on, in our own right. So it's important in establishing a personal identity and giving us a sense of value, of self-worth, self-esteem, that we establish or find meaning and meaningfulness in our lives. And as I've suggested, meaningfulness has a function in our lives. And the primary function of meaningfulness is to help us get through the nasty patches, to deal with misfortunes, to deal with failures and so on, and the many, many shocks and problems that life puts in our way. And there is a considerable literature about exactly this. How or under what circumstances looking for meaningfulness helps us deal with the adversities that we face in everyday life. A study by Davis et al. Back in the late 80s, again, found that dealing with the death of a family member, of a loved one, was made somewhat easier by people who wrote and talked about the experience, tried to find meaning and purpose in it, and so on and so forth. By making sense of the loss, and again, finding something positive, the silver lining in the dark cloud, which could be something as simple as it brought the family closer together, which very often happens in times like this, times of tragedy, for example. And they found that for a year after the loss of the family member, meaning-making, talking about writing, particularly about this event and its impact on them, was associated with a lower level of emotional distress compared with individuals who did not engage in that meaning-making exercise, right? And also for 18 months, finding positives, finding the silver lining, also predicted lower levels of distress compared with a group that didn't look for the silver lining, right, who weren't asked to do that. So again, it looks as though there is a reasonably long-lasting positive effect or ameliorative effect of trying to find purpose, meaning, value, and so on out of negative life events. And again, there are many, many more studies that demonstrate this. That's one example. I'll show you a couple more. But nevertheless, it's a very clear implication of the literature to date, and I don't think it's ever going to change. Again, looking at a study by Taylor and colleagues back in the mid-1980s, again, they talk about the ways in which people try to cope with negative events, and one of them is finding purpose or meaning, right? Another is to find ways to recreate or improve their sense of control over the events in their life. Very often they're dealing with an event over which they had no control, about which they could have done nothing. And of course that leads to lower levels of self-efficacy and lower levels of self-esteem and all of that stuff. And so one way to cope with the shocks of such an event is to find ways to reestablish one's own personal sense of control over one's life. There are a number of possible ways that people might do that, engage in activities over which they do have control and so on and so forth, but nevertheless, this is one way in which they do it. A third way, in addition to looking for meaning, is to finding ways of increasing one's sense of worthiness and self-worth. And we've seen this is closely tied in with, in fact, meaningfulness as well. So these are the things that people do dealing with various kinds of life tragedies. Jim Pennebaker has done an extensive set of studies on the role and value of having individuals dealing with distress, life shocks, writing about it. He has the individuals in his studies write short essays, several paragraphs or more, about how they are feeling with respect to whatever loss they've suffered, what they're doing to deal with it, what its meaning might be for them, and so on and so on and so on. And he compares their reactions and their coping with this tragedy to individuals who do not engage in this meaning-creating exercise. They may end up writing about something else entirely, right, as a control group. And so there are a number of studies. I'm just going to summarize one or two or three, that show this effect of writing. So, for example, in each of these, incidentally, is the result of a different study. I'm not going to indicate which studies are which because it doesn't matter. It just matters that you remember what the outcomes were. And again, we see, as we have seen so often in terms of psychological factors, that they often have a profound impact on the physical functioning of the body. And in one study, at least, Pennebaker and his colleagues found that this kind of meaning creating through writing improved immune system functioning, making individuals less susceptible to infections and better able to deal with whatever infections they happen to encounter in the world around them. He also, in another study, not the same one, found that individuals who engaged in this form of meaning-making about life tragedy needed much less medical attention. They had fewer doctor's visits, they had fewer bouts of illness, and so on. Right? Again, suggesting an impact of meaningfulness, meaning-making or creating on physical functioning. And the last one I'm going to mention, I don't even know what it really would imply about an individual's daily life, but he found that in another study, this form of writing as meaning-making improved the functions of liver enzymes. And of course, it's always nice when one's organs are working better rather than worse, and so presumably that's good, but it doesn't have any obvious, very direct impact that I know of on psychological functioning. There have been several other cases too. All right. Other cases too where we find people able to deal with tragedy and loss of various sorts better by writing about it. Again, this is not all Pennebaker's work, but it's a very common methodology. So in this study by Bauer et al., just about 20 or so years ago, they were looking at an individual who's dealing with the death of an HIV-positive, AIDS-positive partner. And they found that, again, individuals who wrote about it were better able to handle the stress of that loss than those who did not. And it slowed the progression of HIV in their own case as well. Again, suggesting an improvement in physiological functioning as a consequence of this meaning-making. Study by Easterling back in the late 90s. This is an interesting one because it shows two different, it shows phases in the positive effect of meaning-making. So they had individuals write about a traumatic event very shortly after it occurred. And they found that initially, compared with individuals who did not write about and presumably therefore did not do as much thinking about this negative event, had lower levels of positive affect, higher levels of negative affect. It made them feel worse initially to write about, think about this loss. But when they followed them up for a number of months, 6 or 8 weeks, they found the effect reversed. So that after 6 or 8 weeks, the individuals who had written about the tragedy as a way of dealing with it had higher levels of positive affect and lower levels of negative affect compared with the control group that had either written nothing or had written about something unrelated to their loss. Right? So initially, it seems to have a negative impact, at least in this case, but in the longer term, weeks and months, it ends up as a positive in the individual's psychological life to have confronted this tragedy and written about it, thought about it, and considered its meaning and purpose and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Regarding to James' study, these individuals, were they already ill, or did they have...
The individuals in the Bauer study?
No, the James
Oh,
Pennebaker study.
the Pennebaker. I'm not really sure about that. I'd have to go take a peek at that. They were coping, I think, with an illness they already had, I believe. They were already sick, rather than this being a prospective study in which they were followed to see whether they became ill. That's a more challenging study to do. So I'm pretty sure these are individuals who were actually dealing with, And I think it was quite a serious illness, too. It might have been cancer of some form. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
thing that I don't understand is that I understand that if we obviously find meaning in event, that's meaning.
Right.
But when we just find a positive concept of a negative event, how is that meaning? Is it more of a optimistic?
It is a form of optimism, but it gives some purpose to the event. At least it didn't have nothing but negative consequences. It served some function, and some positive function in our life by doing whatever it is you find it to do. Does that help? Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Given the demonstrated importance, significance of meaning creating, meaning finding, in producing positive psychological states, it's no surprise, I think, that there have been a number of forms of psychotherapy which are built around or based on the notion that this is what we should be primarily doing in psychotherapy, is helping an individual create meaning in their lives. And that whatever the individual's pathology might be, it is going to be aided in at least some way. The symptoms are going to be relieved in at least some way by this process of focusing on the meaning and purpose and values in the individual's life. And I just want to mention in passing 2 or 3 of those forms of psychotherapy that do, in fact, do this. One of the more recent ones is the so-called quality of life therapy. And again, this looks at long-term goals, purposes in the individual's life, and tries to prioritize them so as to improve the individual's quality of life and happiness. Designed by Frisch back in the late 90s, which is a very, very recent form of psychotherapy, but it's only about 20 years old. Older than that, however, although I'm citing, again, a study about the same time, we mentioned Wong as one of those individuals who had looked at the areas of life in which meaning was established, and this is the same Wong who then has established meaning-centered counseling. And so, again, it's a way of focusing on the purpose, the values in an individual's life as a way of helping them deal with whatever their psychological issues happen to be. Okay? And again, there are data suggesting that it is an effective form of psychotherapy and counseling. Now, having said that, I should also say, just in general, although it's not directly relevant to our topics, virtually every single form of psychotherapy, no matter how bizarre it might seem, works for somebody. I once had a book, I don't have the most recent edition of it, that was called something like Current Psychotherapies. And it listed hundreds and hundreds, literally, of various ways of performing psychotherapy. Nude encounter groups, shopping therapy, cooking therapy, all kinds of things. And for every single one of these forms of therapy, there was a literature suggesting that at least some proportion of individuals who undertook this form of psychotherapy benefited from it. And again, one can see that very generic result as a form of creating meaningfulness. These people respond to any form of psychotherapy if they believe and if they can find in it some way of establishing a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, whatever that activity might be. As I said, shopping and cooking have been used to do this. All right, anyway, so meaning-centered counseling and goal-focused group psychotherapy. Again, looking at purpose in one's life, looking at the meaning, and of course, a purpose is a form of meaning. What is the purpose of my life? What am I shooting for? What are my long-term goals? And how does that impart to my life a sense of meaning and purpose? And finally, the oldest of the granddaddy of all the meaning-based psychotherapy, Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. This dates from the 1930s, I think, maybe even earlier than that. It's extremely well known, and again, Viktor Frankl was one of those people who experienced firsthand the horrors of the Nazi takeover of Europe during World War II and wrote about the experiences that many people had And it was out of that that logotherapy was born. And I want to end by sharing with you a couple of quotations from Frankl's work, which I can highly recommend. It's very uplifting to read his stuff. He says this, and we can read, as self-actualization, we can read purpose and meaning, for example. Self-actualization is not man's ultimate destination. It is not even his primary intention. Self-actualization, if made an end in itself, contradicts the self-transcendent quality of human existence. Like happiness, self-actualization is an effect, the effect of meaning fulfillment. Only to the extent that man fulfills a meaning out there in the world does he fulfill himself. If he sets out to actualize himself rather than to fulfill a meaning, self-actualization immediately loses its justification. So again, he's comparing self-actualization, a concept we've talked about extensively, with happiness in the sense that it is not and should not be, it cannot be a goal in itself. It is an outcome, it is a consequence of other activities, and Frankl is suggesting that that other set of activity is the search for meaning and appropriate, purposeful life goals. And just one more small quotation also from Viktor Frankl. And I like this analogy because it has a really interesting pictorial quality to it. As the boomerang comes back to the hunter who has thrown it only if it has missed his target, man too returns to himself and is intent upon self-actualization only if he has missed his mission. And again, that comes from Viktor Frankl's best-known book, The Will to Meaning. All right, any questions or comments about any of that? Okay, we're going to stop here for today because I don't want to get a little ways into our next topic. We're down to our last two topics in the course. Gratitude will be the next one, and then we'll end up with forgiveness. So we'll see you next time. Take care.